Yep. Okay. So Walter is a full professor at the Computer Science Department, University of Bristol. And also he is a principal research scientist in Amazon, US. So this is the exciting thing. He received his bachelor degree from the National University of Mexico and his PhD degree from Oxford University. His research on a large on a wide domain of areas, including SLAM, robotics, augmented reality, and he's also working on visual understanding on video, and he has been the co-chair of BMVC 2013, and that's actually how I found him, and the general chair of ISMAR, which is one of the best virtual reality conference. So without further ado, I will pass the table to Walterio, such that he will start the presentation.
Thank you so much, Hoover. It's my pleasure to be here with you today. Can you hear me well and see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, let me know, please interrupt me at any point if there is any degradation in the quality or something is not working with the audio. But yeah, no, thank you so much, Hoover. It's my pleasure to be here with you today. Yeah, I hope that you find something that is interesting here. I will be talking about a few topics that I've been interested for some years now. And I also want to clarify that, yes, I have this dual appointment in industry and academia, but everything that I'm going to discuss today has to do with only my academic research. In my group, we've been interested for a number of years on several topics that, as Hoover was talking about, things that have to do with computer vision, with augmented reality, with robotics, and the intersections between them are things that I'm very interested in. So I have worked with vision for drones, for example, some of the very early drones that perform visual mapping. We developed in collaboration with industry in this case, for example. So this is a drone that is mapping an environment. This is about 10, 12 years ago. And after you have a map, then you're able to plan your motions and navigation more effectively. We have also developed similar mapping methods for robotics. So this is the most advanced robot, the most advanced humanoid robot you never heard of. This was a secret project by Samsung at the time. And this uses what is known as dynamic walking. In this case, it's not using the dynamic walking. Dynamic walking means that you're falling at every step, and that makes it very energy efficient. That's exactly how humans walk. We put together the visual mapping for this robot as well, which is just a collection of points that are sufficient for the robot to have spatial awareness and be able to navigate. And all this was happening at the time in real time on board the robot. We have also done other work on augmented reality. For example, this is from ISMAR 2013, 14, I believe, sorry. And this is how to reconstruct semi-transparent or transparent objects and then be able to augment them with interaction. So in this case, there is a reconstruction of this glass, and then there are virtual objects that are interacting with that thing after it has been reconstructed. Or you can do even more appealing effects, like in this case, you reconstruct something like this glass, and then after you know there is transparent material there, you can apply effects when you have virtual objects going around. Then I will be talking about some other things that I am interested in here. But let me start with what I did for my PhD, which still connects with many of the things that I'm interested in at the moment, which has to do with this notion of active vision. So this is early work. This is one of the outcomes of my PhD is just like a demonstration of wearable active cameras. And in this case, Andrew Davison and Andrew Davison now professor at Imperial College, he developed this early visual slam system. We put together this very early demonstration, which many regard as the first time in which visual slam and augmented reality were working together. And nowadays you can find these everywhere in HoloLens and the Facebook classes and so on. But in this case, the intention was to demonstrate how you can have a setup where there is a camera, an active camera in this case, that is able to build a map in the environment where the person wearing this is. And the application was a remote collaboration application where the remote person is able to essentially see through this active camera, change the point of view independently of how the person wearing this device is moving, and then leave this very basic, so this is 2003, very basic augmented reality annotations like these yellow cubes in here. And after you leave annotations, then the person that is remote is able to go and navigate that space without having to worry about how the person wearing this camera is. So again, this was intended for a scenario in which there is remote collaboration, which is something that I'm very interested in. Actually, some of the work that at Amazon is public now that we've been doing is how you actually connect people. So Amazon Glow, if you come across that, is one of the things that I've been involved in. We have then worked on other things. So this is recent work. So this is a handheld robot, a robot that works as a handheld tool and is perceived as a handheld tool. And what is happening here is that we have this experiment where the robot and the human are trying to solve a problem. In this case, how to take tiles, in this case, virtual tiles, from one location to another. And this particular experiment actually uses gaze tracking. So often you see this yellow ray that is the gaze tracking, which is measured by this gaze tracker mounted on the robot. And the robot is trying to predict what you want to do next, so that it actually helps you. But we also tested this in rebel mode, where the robot actually knows what you want to do, but tries to frustrate you. And we do that because, as you probably know, if you work with humans in the loop, it's very hard to get a good signal from humans in terms of how much cooperation you're getting in a situation like this from a robot that may appear very cool, and you might be biased about providing subjective answers to the experimenter. So what we actually do is we frustrate users, and by that we actually show that we know exactly what the user wanted to do, because users are more keen to report when they are unhappy than when they are happy. So I'm not going to go deep into this, but if anyone is interested, I'm happy to take questions on these sort of things that I just briefly glanced over at any time. Because today I'm going to talk mostly about three different strands of research that in my team we've been looking at. The first one has to do with novel sensors in computer vision. And this, as you probably saw from the title of the talk, I'm interested in what is relevant. How do you sense, how do you compute what is relevant on a scene, for a robot, for a camera, and to be able to act? And the first part has to do with that. The second part is about some work that we have done in terms of affordance determination. That is, how do you decide in a scene what can you go and do where, using our representation that we developed. And then the third part is how to understand skill in video. And this is, how do you actually know that someone is performing well or not so well when they're doing something, and how that can lead to guidance and providing help. So hopefully all this is making sense. And so the first component of the talk has to do with this research that I have done in collaboration with my colleagues at both Bristol and Manchester University. So Peter Dudek works in the electrical and engineering department over there. And for 20 years, he has been working on a new type of combination of sensor and processor, which we call pixel processor arrays. And let me start motivating this piece of the work by just looking at how usual computer vision systems operate. So usually in a computer vision system, for a robotic device, for an augmented reality system, or for IoT, you start with a camera that is a sensor whose task is to essentially send as many images as possible down a bus. Those images are then collected by a CPU. Potentially, you now have to connect these to a GPU in order to have extra computing power. After you do your calculations, then you may connect these other devices via another smaller processor that eventually, after a long chain of steps and intermediate processing, you can reach an actuator. So for a robotic device, if this is your intention, there is a long route for you to go from you sensing something to acting and going through a number of data transformations and bandwidth that is required. With a pixel processor array, a PPA, essentially, the intention is to essentially shorten this path and go directly from image capture to maybe even directly connecting to a motor and an action. And so what is happening here is that the intention of a pixel processor array is that at the time of image capture, you're actually doing processing and sending out of this device, not images, not a bunch of images that is just going to clog your visual pipeline, is high-level information that might be the direction of the speed or the location of something that you're interested in. And you can directly connect that image to the action. And this has great advantages for a number of reasons, because you are able to reduce energy consumption. So compare this system with the previous sketch that we saw with multiple chips that have to translate images and data and deal with enormous amounts of bandwidth. You're reducing the energy consumption. You have a chance to reducing the latency significantly because you have much less intermediaries, and overall you're reducing the complexity of the system. So this is a very, very promising approach. Robotics will be a big beneficiary of this type of new sensor processor device, but you can also imagine that, as I said, IoT and augmented reality devices will benefit from the fact that you don't have to have a lot of energy consumed and steps before you can actually decide what is there. But it's interesting to also think about if this is an entirely new idea. And the reality is that this is not. And for that, I'm going to use this earlier literature, which comes from some of the big names in neurophysiology back in the 50s and 60s, Ledvin, Maturana, and McCulloch, that published this paper back in 1959 that is about what the frog's eye tells the frog's brain. And very interestingly, what they described is that, by the way, this is a frog that my 70-year-old drew for me, a frog that has an eye, and these eyes, they detected, they measured that at the retina of the frog, there are some cells that they just notionally called bug detectors. And what they do is not just to simply detect that there is a black spot against a clean background as a fast way to detect potential insects, but actually these cells respond to the behavior of that black dot. So the way it moves in the visual field, the way it behaves intermittently and stops, actually makes these retinal cells trigger. So it's a sophisticated type of processing that we normally associate with much later stages in the visual processing pipeline. So these bug detectors allow the frog to simplify its visual processing to the point that it can, of course, then quickly react and perform the action that it needs to perform. So this is super interesting because there are already signals and evidence that it's possible to do visual processing without having to capture images. And this is not a notion that is often discussed in computer vision or in robotics even. We often think that cameras are there to grab images, and cameras are not there to grab images. Cameras are there to help us understand and act in the world. Some of them are developed for grabbing images and capturing them, storing them, and then you have to deal with all the bandwidth problems that implies if you really, really want to capture images. But mostly, visual sensors are there to help us understand and act in the world. So I think there is a rethink that is required in order to really benefit from everything that these new type of sensors and processors combinations can give us. So a PPA, essentially, what it has is for every pixel, you have a CPU. Every pixel has a CPU. It's a very basic CPU, but it's a CPU. So it has an ALU, it has some flags, it has some digital and analog registers, and allows you connection with the neighbors. So in principle, you can think of this as combining your sensor with your GPU, and that is what you can get with something like a PPA in a very high level way of describing it. But imagine you can do with that from the point of view of, again, saving energy, saving bandwidth, and so on. And the way in which the PPA works, at least the SCAMP line of PPAs that, again, my colleagues at Manchester, Piotr Durek's work have developed, what you have is for every pixel, you have a register. So you can think of this as you have multiple registers that are copies of the image plane that you can sense, and then you can start doing computation right there at the moment you're capturing light. So you can store registers, you can grab frames from a previous time, you can combine them, you can subtract them, you can shift them. So essentially, you can do a lot of processing in parallel right there. And with this, we have done a number of tasks. So for example, we have this ICCV paper where what we do is visual odometry. So visual odometry is how you're moving from the point of view of the visual field. So we have developed some super basic algorithms. And I tell you that one of the big learnings in this line of projects using the PPA is how to rethink the visual algorithms. Because if we want to go and use standard computer vision pipelines, they are not very efficient for this new type of sensor processor device. So we actually had to rethink. So one of the first things we did, super basic, is visual odometry. And the way in which we do this, this is the visual odometry at work. We take an image and compare it with the incoming image, but we distort it with scale and some basic transformations, all on the PPA. And based on that distortion that we apply at faster than real time, we can do visual odometry with this at 1,000 frames per second. We are able to estimate how the camera is moving. So let's say in this case, the camera is moving in a courtyard, and this is what that sensor is perceiving it's moving about. So you can imagine that you can put this into your VR glasses or robotic systems and be able to have visual odometry right at the point of image capture. And the fact that this is a fully programmable device, you're able to do more than just image capture for visual odometry. You can do object recognition at the same time and so on. So a lot of things can be happening at the same time that you're capturing. We have combined this with other robotic systems and some other things that, for example, is illustrated here. So this is some work we did with drones. So in this case, we're mounting the PPA into a drone, and this is like a setup for one of these drone competitions. In this case, the drone is estimating its orientation relative to those gates, and then computing its motion in order to go through. Again, everything, at least from the sensing point of view, is happening on the PPA. Perhaps more advanced is that this type of devices also lend themselves to be considered for implementing inference and learning on the same device. So imagine that, a camera that is able to learn, a camera that is able to directly make classification and recognition. So by the fact that this is a highly massively parallel device, we have been able to put together some algorithms that use, they're lightweight. We cannot at the moment, because of the hardware constraint, put many layers on the device, but in principle, the technology enables you to expand these further. But even now, we're able to put some lightweight CNNs on PPAs, and then you can run at impressive speeds from the point of view of classification. An example of that, it might not be a very impressive demonstration, this one, but it's actually very interesting because of the cable that hopefully you're able to see here through Zoom. This is aiming to classify gestures, and we can get 8,000 frames per second. I'm less interested on that. I'm more interested in this order number, which is from image to class in 121 microseconds. And we believe we can improve on this substantially more. But what I was saying about this cable is that this is a demonstration that we can go from the sensing directly, because the PPA is able to compute the necessary signals to send to a servo motor. So we're connecting directly a camera to an actuator. In this case, it's a very, very basic linking. This servo motor is actually fairly slow, so it's not anywhere close to be able to benefit from the speeds that we can have here. But it's a good demonstration that we can go from perception to action with substantially less bandwidth requirements and clutter. PPAs will have other applications. So this is other work where what we have done is actual mapping and localization. So essentially what we have here is an example where the camera is moving and is collecting images as it's moving, and it's making a decision of which images to collect in order to build a visual map of the environment. So it's a very simple map. It's a collection of 2D images, but often these collections of 2D images are sufficient for you to know where you are. So essentially the sensor is moving through the city, is collecting images, and when it then visits that location again, it tries to find a match. In this case, we actually implemented something like a particle filter. It's not a full particle filter, but it's something like a close to a particle filter factored sampling, and is able to follow that person through that journey based on the images that it has collected before. So this is again a camera that is performing mapping on its own. So we have this recent paper, ICRA 2021, that talks about that. So I see a lot of potential on this type of new sensor that are specially dedicated for the visual sensing and action. So it's not visual sensing just for the sake of simplicity, that we can just grab a sensor and be clogged with images. Are sensors that are now starting to emerge that are thought from the point of view of how we need to process the visual information. Okay, so that's one of the lines of work that we're doing in my lab. The other line of work that we're very interested in is this other one that has to do with how to understand what is relevant to perceive on interactions. In the previous section, we talked about what is relevant from the point of view of sending outside of the visual sensor. In this case, we're interested of when you have something out there, how to decide what is relevant. And specifically, there is this concept of affordances that in robotics and augmented reality, I think is very important to grasp. And this is work in collaboration with two of my PhD students. And in case you are not familiar with the concept of affordance, let me start with this super basic example. So if I ask you, what do you see there? I don't think there will be a lot of controversy about what that is, even if the object is transparent, and you might have questions about what exactly its shape and dimensions are. I think you will be able to tell me something that this is a glass. And what is a glass good for? Well, the most obvious answer we will normally expect to hear is I can drink from it, right? So I can put water on it. The reality is that the world is substantially more complex than that, because these same objects can serve as a paperweight if we have to, or it can help us to build castles like in this photograph. We have in computer science and specifically AI been going through this age where we want to classify everything. And particularly now with deep learning and these approaches, there is even more obsession about how do I get the data so that I can classify these objects into categories. But categories actually can be very damaging from the point of view of understanding the world, because when I ask what is a glass good for, it's just good for a lot of things. And these are just 3 examples. I'm sure we can imagine hundreds of other ways in which this object can be used. And so if we wanted to classify all these possibilities, then it just makes no sense for us to try to gather all the data and all the labeling that is required when we know that we can get there in other ways. And this is precisely what the concept of affordance aims to capture. So I have to say that it's a concept that there is a lot of dispute about what it is, what it's not, how it works. So this was coined by Gibson in experimental psychology back in the 70s, and aims, in my view, to explain what happens where and what can you do with that. But more importantly to me, I think it's a concept that can help us to rescue ourselves from the surrendering to the data statistics that I was describing a moment ago. And so even that the concept of affordance is a fairly elusive concept in many senses, it's clear that it's not about classifying things. It's more about understanding the relationship that exists between an object and a scene. And with this in mind, we actually developed a refinement to some earlier work. Actually, whoever you will may recognize some of these motivations, because I actually took inspiration from Taku, which I understand was your advisor. So Taku and his group developed this concept which is called the IBS, which is the interaction bisection surface. But we took a slightly different variation to that, and we went back to the bisector surface, and we tried to find a representation that was useful for our robotics and augmented reality needs, to be able to represent objects without having to classify. Because many of the representations that are out there still aim to classify objects. And I'm far more interested in understanding what is that representation that can help us to understand the relationship between things. And we start with this very basic example. So you have an object here, which is in blue, is a ball in 2D for simplicity. And then we have a scene object here, which is a table. And we might have an action, which is just placing that ball on the table. And there is this concept in geometry that is called the bisector surface, that is essentially is this surface that has all these that links the points. So it is a surface that exists between the points between two objects. So it's very simple to define and compute. What we do here in order to create this auto way to represent the interaction that we call the interaction tensor is we first sample. We tried to be clever about how to sample, and we essentially found that there was no need to be clever. So just some basic random sampling with some basic weighting about the distances in between the objects was sufficient for us to describe. So we sample that, and then we compute the vectors that we call the provenance vectors that tell us from where each one of these points come from. And we do that because in the original bisector surface, you really have no idea what is the actual relationship that exists between the surface and the points in there. So essentially, we're just adding the vectors. Only one side is necessary here. So we add the vectors that tell us from where these sample points that we randomly chose, or with another sampling approach you choose, from where these points came from. And this collection of vectors is what we call the interaction tensor. As simple as that. And just in a similar way to the bisector surface, but now in a tensor representation, we're able to show that you can find that the interaction tensor preserves a lot of similarity, even if the objects are changing, or even if the scene is changing. So very similar to the bisector surface, but now you have a discrete representation from where you know exactly from where the points come from, which allows you to have better refinement at the time when you have to detect these interactions again. So with this, we're able to essentially very simply and very quickly compute this interaction tensor when we have two objects interacting. And from a single example, and so this was very exciting to me coming from the computer vision and robotics fields, where, as we just said, usually you require a lot of data to train any model. From a single example, we're able to find objects that, for example, in this case, a simulated robot is trying to know where it can do what. So where can it place things, or where can it find or expect to find humans? So it observes a scene and then is able to identify that humans may exist in these locations with what probabilities. And to me, so some exciting things are related to how you can actually discover very interesting interactions. So I remember when my son was 3 years old, he used to pretend play that the sofa was a motorcycle. And if you do that with other methods like just bisector surface or naive ICP type approaches, which often are even slower than what you can do with the interaction tensor, you can find these very interesting possibilities. So again, affordances. And of course, this has many applications from the point of view of being able to discover things from a single example. So let's say you can discover where you're going to hang things or where you're going to place things. You can create scenes for augmented reality that were not scripted. So all these scenes that you see here have not been scripted, but they appear fairly realistic. And we have done studies with Mechanical Turk to validate that our approach is better than the baselines from the point of view of creating and proposing natural interactions. And more recently, we have taken a step towards using these humanoid interactions, where the humanoid shape, of course, is more rich. You can have different body shapes and sizes and poses. And so we're able to find these interactions. So you give a scene, and just by the geometry of the scene, you're able to find quite sensible and plausible interactions that are based purely on the affordances that you can detect with the interaction tensor. things like, yes, you can find people sitting on chairs, but also at the edge of the sofa, or things that are not chairs, that can be things like a cabinet here, which normally humans will actually also find as a sittable location, without us having to actually force the classification that this is sitting and this is not sitting. So that's part two, where we were looking at how to find what is relevant in the scene for the actions that we want to perform. Now, the next step, which in my group we have also been very keen to investigate, is how to understand skill and hand-object interactions from video. So this is work in collaboration with my colleagues. Dima, it's now a professor at Bristol as well. Hazel was our PhD student. Yao is my PhD student that has been looking at manipulation in the later part. And the motivation for us actually started with an EPSSC project called Glance, where we wanted to develop guidance for augmented reality. So everyone has faced this. You are in front of a printing machine or a copier or a coffee machine, or you want to build your bicycle and you have no instructions, and you trying to find the instruction manual or trying to find information on the web actually can be very bad. What if you actually just by looking at something, you suddenly summon the information that many other people have actually already succeeded about in terms of being able to accomplish that task? So we developed an earlier system that essentially does that without any sophistication. We call it Glacier. We published that in Augmented Human 2017. It just has on Google Glass, everything on board is able to recognize objects and then link that visual appearance with the videos of someone else that has used that object before. And it worked very well. And I will explain why this actually works much better than many other augmented reality systems that myself and my team have built before. But one of the key things here, and one of the key questions that motivate this skill determination work, is you can have a collection of videos, which is the YouTube problem. You want to assemble your bike, you go to YouTube, and what do you find? You find hundreds of videos. How do you know who to trust? Or you actually get distracted by a music video that you actually were not looking at, but you actually get distracted by that because the information is totally disorganized. What if you were actually able to connect these moments of need with video? And the reason why we're using video has to do with the power of imitation. So humans, we often encounter the situation where you see someone else doing something in a slightly better way or much better way than you are able to do, and you copy. And the fact that you copy allows you to essentially be better every time that you are observing someone else doing something. And the underpinning of this is actually the motor mirror neurons that we have that curiously has been shown to exist beyond humans. And this is a video by Anna Wilkinson from the University of Lincoln of a lizard watching a video of another lizard solving a problem, and therefore learning from that video how to solve that problem that they want. By the way, have you been able to hear some audio in the videos? Hopefully, yes.
Yeah.
But
yes,
okay, so I'll let you watch. So the lizard just watched a video of this other lizard solving the problem.
Initial bout of head banging suggests he's forgotten what he's seen in the video. But suddenly, Oscar makes a breakthrough and he's gulping down his grubby root. Copy the dragon in the video almost perfect, using the front foot to slide the gate to the left. The 8 bearded dragons tested in this way, the results were the same. The dragons that didn't see the solution in the video couldn't do it, but the dragons that did were munching mealworms within seconds. Anna has clear evidence that they are solving problems by imitation.
And this is just an example. There are many other examples out there in the animal kingdom. I recently came across a paper on Drosophila melanogaster, which is one of the smallest flies you can possibly imagine from the point of view of neural circuitry there. And there is some indication that they are able to actually copy from others and then change their behavior. So, which is amazing. So there has to be an underpinning mechanism, universal mechanism perhaps, by which you can make an assessment of if you're going to copy something that is better than what you are able to do or that you were before not able to do. And therefore, there has to be also ways by which we can assess who is better and who is best, and hopefully be able to learn from those. So we have this, the first paper we published on this was CVPR 2018, that essentially is called Who's Better, Who's Best. And we developed a method where we're able to show that on different tasks, we can train a network that is able to make an assessment for ranking videos. And we got the labeling by mechanical torque, where we were showing 2 videos over mechanical torque and just asking random people who is better, right? And with that information, there is a lot of noise and ambiguity we have to deal with. But with that information, we're able to train a network, and within tasks, it's not a general method. So I still long for being able to have an answer for how to do universal scale assessment. But within a specific task, within all the constraints that I just described, we're able to show that we can make assessments instead of ranking. And then we have evolved this work. So this is another paper from CVPR 2019. Let me just play the video and let Hazel explain.
There may be variability of skill exhibited throughout the video. In this example, the left video shows better skill in egg cracking. However, as the videos proceed, higher overall skill is shown in the right-hand video. Trained attention can also exclude parts irrelevant for skill assessment. Let's present qualitative results. We show video segments with strong attention responses to the low skill module for various tasks. In surgery, strain on the material is a sign of low skill present in only low-rank videos. In apply eyeliner, segments show mistakes being fixed. In origami, the module attends to undoing previous faults. For high skill module attention responses, system performance can be seen in the segments with straightening edges, dough rolling, and origami. Interestingly, for drawing, pausing to consider is indicative of high skill. Next, we show videos ranked by our method and demonstrate the varying attention over time. Response of the high skill module in green show increased attention, the bean is being picked up. The low skill module, shown in red, tends to difficulties gripping beans. In Thai, we see that, for the most part, our method correctly ranks pairs of videos. It only struggles with pairs close in the ranking, such as the first and second videos displayed here. These are swapped in the ground. For longer tasks, such as scrambling eggs, filter responses are more sparse. Green demonstrates segments attended to by the high skill module, while red indicates the low skill module's attention.
So this is a more sophisticated model by which we're able to specifically identify parts of the video that may contribute towards better ranking or lower ranking. And there is much to be done in this space. So one of the recent data sets we released on this is people assembling a camping tent, which is a deformable object, so much more complex than rigid objects that are commonly used in computer vision robotics. In this case, there is people doing this task with a flexible object, and the data set is available for people to try. So we have done some basic work in terms of identifying moments within these tasks. But eventually, as I said, I think there is a lot to be done from the point of view of understanding skill and ranking it. And then this last piece of work is by Yao, my student, who recently had a paper in ISMAR 2021, where what we want to do is you can have a video of a task, and you want to understand what the key steps of that tasks are, so that we can do skill assessment per step, or we can provide guidance. Remember the motivation of this piece of work, which we want to provide guidance to people. And if we can identify in which step you are, and if you have performed that step incorrectly, we can immediately provide assistance without you having to prompt it. And so the first piece of work for being able to do that is how to segment natural interactions between hands and objects using vision. So in the ISMAR paper, Yao describes everything that is happening. But one crucial thing that happens here is that we do not pre-train the objects that we are observing. And this is crucial because, of course, there has been quite a lot of work in you train your objects, and of course, then you recognize the objects, and then you know what's happening. We're not interested in that. We're interested in, again, a more general understanding of what's happening in that video. And so what this method is aimed at is trying to recognize when your hands are interacting with objects, and then making an assessment of if that interaction is a new step or part of a previous step, so that we can correctly split that this is actually a new data set we also present as part of the ISMAR 2021 paper, which is Chinese tea making. So Yao, actually, who was in lockdown over there in Wuhan at the time, terrible times we live in, but he actually used his time to grab a lot of videos with his family over there, repeating this traditional task of making Chinese tea. And so we have some videos that are slightly different. Then we have grand truthing by golden annotators, as you might call, which of course there is a lot of subjectiveness of what is the correct number of steps in something like this. But eventually we're able to do, not just with this data set, but other data sets that are out there in the literature, able to segment into constituent steps an action like this in preparation for the guidance or the skill assessment. And so more details on this on the paper, and super happy to talk more about the new step. But just to conclude, I have spoken about several things. So hopefully you at least found something of interest in the things that I described, that my group and I are interested in. So one of the first things that we saw is it's important to sense only what you need. So sensing more than what you need actually can bring a lot of downsides to your processing pipeline. And for that, we have a new line of sensors and processors combinations that can help us with that. Affordances, looking at affordances and trying to understand the relationship between objects and scenes is potentially a way out of the obsession with classification and data statistics that we're currently going through. And then the understanding of what is happening and the assessment of the quality of what is happening is indeed one step towards being able to fully utilize the interactions that we're surrounded with. So thank you very much. With this, I conclude the talk, and I'm super happy to hear any questions.
Thank you very much, Walter.
Thank you.
Questions from the audience?
Yeah, I have one on the PPA.
Yes, please.
So what is the kind of physical size or weight of the device, and what kind of power consumption it needed?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I have to start by saying that the current technology used for the PPA is 20 years old. So these are academic pieces of work. So the potential for you to miniaturize and make it far more energy efficient and far better is like a no-brainer. if you actually use the latest technology. And of course, this is the work by the hardware is the work by my colleague in Manchester, Piotr. In terms of the physical size, the device that we use, like in the last 4 or 5 years, is like this. So it's not bigger than a webcam, but the latest device is closer to a thumbnail. So you're able to miniaturize this substantially more.
I mean, can it be compatible with many different kind of sensors, like, for example, thermal camera or any other camera, or like stereo camera? What kind of compatibility it will have, or it has?
Yeah, that's another good question, because the notion of you having a sensing element and a processor theoretically is compatible with a range of sensors, right? So there is actually a version that I understand they worked that had the IR ability as well, and they were thinking about stereo. So how can you have two sensors? It starts to become slightly more complex when you want to do stereo, because you have to have connections that are long range, and that can bring noise. So stereo maybe is less likely to be easy to implement compared to other types of sensors that you can have.
And the last one. So
sure.
Like, is the standard computer vision library, for example, PyTorch or OpenCV, can you directly install it? I mean, for example, if you want to install OpenCV on, let's say, NVIDIA Xavier board, so we need to go through set of different process and little bit different, slightly different. Is it is it straightforward installation, standard installation, or how?
So that's another good question, because there is a simulator that we put together as part of our EPSSC project, which you can find in project-agile.org. There is a simulator for the PPA. Now, you can in principle use other libraries to integrate with this simulator. However, as I was trying to argue as part of the talk, one of the biggest learnings we had to do is, if you want to use traditional methods on a massively parallel architecture like this, actually it might actually not being able to fully benefit from the capability here. So you rethinking your algorithms, sometimes even simplifying them, but benefiting from the parallel nature of computation, is perhaps a very important step that has to happen.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much.
Sure. And happy to follow up later if there is any more interest in that.
Any more questions? Well, can I ask a question about the bisector surface? Well, actually, the interaction tensors.
Yes.
So does the interaction tensors performance affected by imperfect surfaces that is generated by noisy point cloud in the real world? When you scan a room, you have very noisy point cloud, and you generate a surface, and that kind of surface tend to have a lot of holes, right? So in original bisector surface work, I think they are affected by these sorts of holes very heavily. So that's why they use 3D mesh directly rather than using real world data. We do have some real world demo, right? So how is your experience?
That's right. Yeah, that's a great. So for example, this is a point cloud. We're not parameterizing. So this is the raw point cloud, super noisy, and still we're able to find affordances here. And I believe that the reason why we're able to handle these interactions better without having to deal with the uncertainty and complexity here is precisely because of the incorporation of the provenance vectors. So instead of having the bisector surface in there, we essentially sample that, and we have the exact points that you calculated when you provided the training. Now, I think your question is interesting because the training was performed under no noise. So on the training, we actually have a clean training, but because we have the provenance vectors that come from the sampling of the bisector surface, and the provenance vector give us the direction and the distance, we're able to go and test those vectors in the noisy environment and then verify if you have something close to that or not. So we are not affected when we're making the inference. We might be affected when we do the training, but the training we do under a clean environment. So essentially, all the trainings that we have here actually came from a simulated scene. So I find this also very interesting because let's say we trained on, let me go to, we train the hanging of the hook. You might not be able to see because it's very small, but we have the coat hanger here. And this is the example that we use for training what we later were able to detect here, where you can have, this is actually like a tripod. A second ago, the system showed that it can detect, you can hang it there, but you can also detect that you can hang in the corner of the table as well, even if you never trained with that. And so great question, because with the interaction tensor and the provenance vectors, you're able to tolerate noise much better.
Yeah, it's actually very impressive. Yeah. I also have another question about the,
yes, please.
The PPM. You mentioned a few times that the computer vision pipeline needs to be rethink. Well, now that the sensor is a bit smarter, it is capable of understanding things and doing some operations. Now that sort of rings a bell because I was doing a bit of a Ministry of Defense DASA project, and they always emphasize that they have this sort of distributed sensor network for surveillance.
Right.
And they have a name called something like Sapien or something. And the emphasis is like they wish the sensor to only send very limited information, useful information, rather than a big image back to the server. So is this something that your PPM can facilitate as well?
That's a great question, Hubert, as well, because I do think that the fact that you only are sending the minimal amount of information, you spoke about that field of work, but in my opinion, a much bigger field of work where this can have a huge impact is in privacy. Like we want to put more cameras around us and not fear the fact that there are cameras around us. We really need to solve the problem of privacy. And one way in which you can solve the problem of privacy is if the camera that is out there is detecting only what it needs to detect and not sending anything else that it should not be sending, or recording stuff that later ends compromising your privacy or otherwise. So I think it's very important to understand that there are alternatives to visual sensing that do not have as much privacy concerns, especially if we architect the information properly. We have to be careful. So there's a lot to be done, because it's not the fact that if you just blur the image, you are actually preserving privacy, because there are methods in which you can actually reverse those filters. You really need to think how you're going to send the information, but there is a higher chance that you can do that when you have a sensor processor that at the time of image capture, you're able to do the processing, disregard everything else, which is already good for bandwidth, but it can be great for privacy as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think privacy is actually even more of a benefit than bandwidth, because I also talk with these care home people.
Yes, exactly.
And they are very eager to use vision-based algorithms to monitor or support older people living alone,
right,
for detection and so on, but they never get through the privacy step.
Exactly.
So your sensor probably serve as a future for this direction.
Yeah, and you, with something like this, you essentially, with the right algorithms, you can guarantee that you cannot reverse the images, right?
Yeah.
At least. So.
Great. Any more questions? So if there's no more question, then we'll call it a day, and we thank our speaker. If you have questions that you wish to ask, you can also email the speaker as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and discuss it offline. So thank you very much, Walterio. Very interesting talk.
My pleasure, Hubert, and best wishes to everyone over there. And looking forward to connect with you in case you're interested in some of these lines for cooperation.
Definitely. Yeah. Thank you.